Is it because you came from Canada?
Okay, I think we'll get started and let people filter in. Welcome to this panel on reading and teaching intersectionality. We have this is my favorite part of any conference, when I get to introduce people for whom I have great respect and then get to listen to them. So it's not a bad deal, right? We have three panelists with us today. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. Barbara Tomlinson, who is sitting in the middle, is Associate Professor at the Department of Feminist Studies at UC Santa Barbara. And she studies rhetoric and feminist politics, feminist theory and analysis, critical race theory, culture and reproduction, among other things. One of her recent books, her most recent book, Feminism and Affect at the Scene of Argument Beyond the Trope of the Angry Feminist. I don't know any of those. And she's currently at work on a book co-written called Writing Truth to Power. On her left is Anna Carastathis, who received her PhD at McGill University and then went on to a postdoc at the University of Montreal, and just recently joined the faculty at Cal State Los Angeles in the Department of Philosophy. But she teaches and researches on feminist philosophy, critical race theory, post-colonial and anti-colonial thought, Marx and Marxism. And on the right, but not really on the philosophical right, my colleague Noah Zatz here at the law school, who got his JD at Yale and joined the UCLA law faculty in 2004. Some of his recent work includes an article in the Columbia Law Review entitled Managing the Macaw, Third-Party Harassers, Accommodation, and the Disaggregation of Discriminatory Intent. And another one in the University of Chicago Legal Forum, The Minimum Wage as Civil Rights Protection, an alternative to anti-poverty arguments, ? So I refer you to these writings that these folks have made, and Anna has brought with her in the handouts two of the courses that she teaches with course outlines and syllabi. As I said, if we didn't have enough copies and you would like copies of those, please, our room coordinator is down here doing a great job of getting us together, and just give her your name and email address. I'll make sure that a copy gets scanned and sent to you by email. And I'm Chris Littleton, right? I'm on the faculty of the law school, and I'm also the chair of the Department of Women's Studies here at UCLA. And I teach and work in the area of feminist legal theory, intersectional legal theory, and women's studies. So without more than that, I'm going to turn things over to Barbara to get us started on this wonderful panel. We will have lots of time for discussion. I've asked the panelists to keep their remarks relatively short, so that what we'll do is have presentations and then some time for the panelists to actually talk to each other, ask each other some questions, thereby modeling and opening up for you our discussion with the audience, because you are going to be as important a part of this panel as we are. So thank you very much. And Barbara?
Thank you. We were told our panel title was Reading and Teaching Intersectionality. And I thought I would finesse it a little and put together the notion that what I do is teaching reading and intersectionality. I'd like to bring out a term that is actually drawn through kind of a long genealogy from Avery Gordon, from Toni Morrison, who used it to talk about Toni Cade Bambara's work. And the phrase we use is, what's the work you want your work to do? And what I want to talk about is the way I actually teach all my courses like this, but the one I'm focusing on is a feminist theory course required of all students in the doctoral emphasis at UCSB, which are students from about 15 different departments, from Chicano studies to religious studies to sociology and so on. So if you want to be a doc studies major, you don't have to take this class, but you have to take this or a set of other classes. It was built on a kind of problem solver model. I kept trying to figure out what was interfering with students doing what I felt they needed to do. And this tends to extend backwards to, you think, well, they should have learned to ride a bicycle differently. But since I couldn't go back that far, I tried to deal with closer. And the way I talk about this, I have two sets of arguments, and I'll say at the outset, I was a little startled when I began to read things on intersectionality for this panel. I've just concluded this book on feminism and affect at the scene of argument beyond the trope of the angry feminist, and in it I develop a number of terms involving transforming the terms of reading, seeing the intersection between academic and non-academic discourses as a promiscuous conversation of texts, drawing attention to the labor of argument and what it means. But that book was a discussion of the rhetoric of sort of vehement feminist arguments and also the rhetoric of anti-feminist arguments. But I discovered when I looked at some of the critiques of intersectionality that have been published in recent years, some of them seem to deploy very similar rhetorical strategies, and I find that disturbing, and I want to explain how, if you were my graduate student, I would teach you not to do that. I often ask the graduate students to imagine themselves in a scene that Kenneth Burke described. It's a famous scene called Burke's Parlor. One enters the scene and there are groups of people in conversation, and you wander through the room and you decide, well, okay, I'll listen into that conversation. And then when you listen for a while, you think, okay, I could say something, I could talk about that argument, and then you contribute. And then the day grows long and the conversations keep going, but you must leave, and you leave the room and the conversations continue. The thing that I like about Burke's Parlor, it makes me sort of shiver every time I say it, is that I think it reminds us of something that I think it's easy to lose sight of, which is we're engaged in conversations with people who've been dead a long time and people who aren't yet born. And therefore, there's nothing casual about our academic work. There's nothing merely academic about our academic work. So then what I work with my students to do is to try to figure out what is the work they want their work to do. In other words, Toni Morrison was arguing that one of the things that made Toni Cade Bambara's work effective was it knew the work it wanted its work to do. It had a social vision of what it wanted to accomplish. I think it's easy for students to go to graduate school, have a generally left progressive position, not know how to deal with that, often feel that their personal repulsion at Republicans is itself a political position of value, and they've sort of taken care of politics then. There's also a bizarre sort of Oedipal thing that goes on, and in feminist theory it's, the bad mothers and so on. The conditions of possibility of our arguments are conditions of subordination. I can't allow my graduate students to start talking about the arguments we're reading from the positions that they're in now, because those positions are already corrupted by habits of reading and habits of thinking that are going to lead them astray. So you'll find I'm going to give you some do's and don'ts that I do. I'm not telling you to do them. I'm telling you what I tell my graduate students. And when I started doing it, I realized that I sound kind of bossy. And this is not your consciousness-raising session. That's not the task. So I thought I would say that it's because I follow Lady Pink, the graffiti artist, who at a talk on hip-hop at UCLA, somebody in the audience said, "Do you call yourself a feminist?" And she says, "You can call me a feminist. I don't care as long as you shut up and do what I say." So that's sort of the attitude I take. Now what this means my job is as a teacher is to be the kind of person who can help my students learn to do the work they want their work to do. That means that I have to have them take a stance that allows them to spend a lifetime growing and changing and thinking, and not see themselves as being able to solve other people's problems immediately, or being able to solve their personal problems through academic display, if that only worked. Anna, who will speak next, argues that a prerequisite for transformation of political practice is an uncompromising interrogation of one's own privilege and complicity in structures of domination. I absolutely agree, but I stipulate that such interrogation requires also taking responsibility for one's argument and for the rhetorical positions you take in making those arguments. If our debates take place in a discursive arena saturated with racial and sexual power, that's the terrain we have to work with. As Cedric Robinson argues, racial regimes are hostile to their own exhibition. Their hostility is often displayed in discourses that encourage affiliation with dominant narratives through complex means of identification and repudiation. There are pleasures in mounting what one imagines to be a good critique, say, of intersectionality, but these are enmeshed in those power relations. Rhetoric's arguments, positions that might appear merely part of a feisty career in some disciplines assume different dimensions when deployed as part of a promiscuous conversation of texts whose conditions of possibility are racial and gender subordination. In the book I just completed, I examined places where snide remarks by anti-feminist or even, I don't know, faux feminist academics were used by anti-feminists to tear down feminism as a whole. There's nothing better than finding one of them you can use against them. I encourage my students, all my classes are called Thinking With, and then there's something else after that, but I don't say I'm teaching them theory, I teach them thinking with theory, which no one I teach is going to be a maker of theories, a doer of critical theory, but they are going to all have to use theory, think with theory, change the way they think because of theory. So I tell them that if you think with theories, you can look at how theories are used, at what scholars find in theories to inform their own arguments, how they draw on theories as tools for thinking about and solving intellectual problems. You can draw connections between theories, feminist, racial, queer theories, not according to topics, which students get very taken about. Somebody talked about this, and so they're the person I have to rely on, when in fact there are all sorts of things about research arguments that cut across topics. What do the theorists want their work to do? So those are some of the do's. That's what I do. Here's some of the things I don't. I block ways that they can evade reading and analysis. I structure class to forestall habitual reading practices used to avoid and dismiss arguments in a variety of ways. Attack mode attacks the author personally for failure to meet special rules. Skim and opine uses the topic of the text to provide an opportunity for the most important issue is, what do I think about that? Expressing feelings fronts how one feels about the topic rather than analyzing the text. Evaluating the text as good or bad, which connects to the critiques of intersectionality that began to concern me when I was preparing this talk. They skip the need to think about, why is the text constructed in that way? What rhetorical situation was the author in that led things to be phrased in that way? Because often that has a bigger impact than one would think on the specific phrasing. The reason I don't allow this, I flat out forbid it, is because these make people feel they're engaged in analysis. They mimic analysis, but they substitute for it. They supplant it. When you have condemned a particular position without actually knowing why that was the person's position or being able actually to adequately explain what that position was to someone else, you have a feeling of satisfaction that's very, very great. And I'm denying you that. See, I really, Lady Pink, she did something with baseball bats that I want to imitate too. So I think my time is close to up. Let me connect this to the kind of critiques. What I would say, having read some of these critiques, is that I would urge my students to not choose that kind of critique as the work they want their work to do. Don't personify and treat as a singular theoretical tools or groups of loosely affiliated scholars. Intersectionality is a set of related intellectual tools to provide leverage against power. Yet recent critiques speak of it as if it were singular or specific. In fact, as if it were a person or an agent. I saw a number of places where people said intersectionality promises things. And it failed on those promises, by the way. It aspires to do this, and I wonder, do you sign in a book saying, I hereby aspire to do this? I mean, really, I aspire to have racial and gender justice, and that probably keeps me going, but it's hardly that I establish that as an expectation if you read what I write. Don't criticize political intellectual tools and ways to frame research on subordination according to criteria from idealized models of scientific theory and discovery. First of all, these are not actually accurate models of scientific theories and discovery. They are what retired biologists proposed as models after they left their careers in science. But in any case, the idea that figuring out how to persuade people to treat others with justice is anything similar to discovering, something in the natural sciences, it's an inappropriate comparison. We're really in the ditches, and they are not. Don't use modernist teleological or aesthetic criteria to criticize political intellectual tools and ways to frame research on subordination. I was amazed how many people talked about intersectionality as needing coherence, and I wondered if they realized that coherence is a discursive construct that we put together and pat ourselves on the back with. It actually has very little to do with the nature of the theory we're saying is coherent. It's a claim that reveals our satisfaction, not the nature of the theory. New works the same way. The notion, if you read James Baldwin, we could none of us speak and just use James Baldwin because he says the things we need to say. I mean, so are we saying that only if I can say something absolutely and totally new in a context that establishes what I say as an anti-racist and a feminist as a weary, boring repetition of old claims we've all heard? And in the face of that, I'm supposed to say something new for my colleagues to hear me. I think this is a specious criteria. So these are some suggestions I have of what I do when I'm teaching not just intersectionality, but other theories also, to make sure that I'm in the strongest position possible to help my students do the work their work should do.
Anna?
Can you hear me in the back? Yeah? Is that a bit better? Okay. First of all, let me say how honored I am and somewhat surprised I am to be participating in this discussion with you and with my panelists today. I'd like to thank the organizers, particularly Professor Crenshaw and Dr. Ribbett, for inviting me to share my thoughts for what they're worth about reading and teaching intersectionality this afternoon. Let me also say at the outset that I'm a relatively new teacher. The reflections I share with you are based on my modest 6 years of teaching experience, during which time the development of something that we could call an intersectional pedagogy has been a central concern of mine. Much of my teaching experience is in women's studies, but my disciplinary home is in philosophy. I'm now, as you were told, an assistant professor in philosophy at Cal State LA here in Los Angeles. I've taught different classes on intersectionality as a concept, as a research method, at 2 different institutions, at Cal State and at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute, which is a women's studies institute at Concordia University in Montreal in Canada. And I've circulated, for your interest, 2 sample syllabi from that experience, from those experiences. My aim in developing an intersectional pedagogy and curricula dovetails with the broader aim of all my teaching, which is to help students cultivate their critical consciousness. For me, teaching is a transformative practice and an incredibly rewarding, if also an incredibly trying job. What makes it rewarding is the same thing that, for me at least, makes it difficult. It's a collective practice of transformation, which leaves none of us, student or teacher, unchanged. I'm a teacher then because I believe in the transformative power of education. I believe in it because I have lived it, because I've been blessed to have teachers who changed my life and who changed my perceptions of what was possible. I've had teachers who have expanded the limits of my imagination and of my aspirations. But I've also experienced the power of education to limit my world, to diminish me in my being, to exclude me and others as knowers, as epistemic authorities, to justify injustice and to suppress dissent. Education can be emancipatory, but it can be oppressive. We're daily educated into racism, into colonialism, into misogyny, into homophobia and heteronormativity, and into ableism. We're daily educated into the inevitability of injustice, of capitalism, of violence, and of war. And this is another reason that I'm a teacher, because others are, others who would have us and our young people swallow these lessons. I believe we need cognitive defenses against oppressive education, and one of those defenses in the present moment is intersectionality. I see intersectionality as an indispensable tool, but also as an imperfect concept that risks, I think, reifying the very categories it was initially used to critique. My approach to teaching intersectionality is to use it as a transitional concept, which exposes the limitations of existing categories of identity and of existing social movements. In order to do this, I think it's incredibly important for us as teachers of intersectionality and for the students that we teach to be readers of the tradition of Black feminist thought from which intersectionality emerges. And it's crucial that we read Crenshaw's text in which intersectionality as a metaphor and as a positive concept originates. So when I was introduced to intersectionality as an undergraduate student in philosophy, it was by another, or through another text, an essay by the philosopher Diana Tietjens-Myers. My first responses to intersectionality were informed by Myers' deployment of that concept. And I was surprised to find a very different conceptualization of intersectionality some years later when I closely engaged Crenshaw's 1989 essay and her 1991 essay while writing my dissertation. I think given the evident amenability of intersectionality to a range of uses and interpretations, it's important to seek its origins in the Black feminist critique of exclusionary, anti-racist, and feminist politics, and of monistic concepts of discrimination in law. In my view, intersectionality has been detached in many projects from its original critical purpose and harnessed to a range of other intellectual aims. To appreciate and critically engage the ways in which intersectionality has traveled from critical race theory to women's and gender studies, to sociology, to political science and beyond, we need to trace its origins and read the original text in which it was first articulated. Philosophers are all about reading the original text, at least when it comes to texts written by white men. In my view, we need to be critical about the ease with which intersectionality, a contribution of Black feminist thought, has been appropriated and, to use Patricia Hill Collins' formulation, commodified, without sustained engagement with Black feminist and womanist thought. So as a philosopher, a student of philosophy, I value the conceptual clarity that I believe this kind of contextual, close reading can provide. So in my courses on intersectionality, I guide students through the literature to show how intersectionality is a polysemic term, and that the consensus about its meaning, I think, is actually kind of superficial. As an anti-racist feminist educator, I think students stand to learn quite a lot from first-hand engagement with Black feminist thought, which is marginalized in the academy and is rendered virtually invisible in my discipline, the discipline of philosophy. Because it's conflated with the hyper-specific, Black feminist thought is constructed as only relevant to describing Black women's lives, as opposed to the putatively generic thought of white male philosophers, which ostensibly has universal significance. So we must still consider what St. Augustine had to say on the subject of the morality of gay marriage, say, right? Example from real life. Even though the whole thrust of my classes on intersectionality is to disrupt these mappings of the generic and the specific, and to undermine their epistemic and political consequences, nevertheless, some of my students, who are not Black women, would remark that they don't see themselves or the relevance of intersectionality to their own identities or experiences. As Latina women, and I thought that was interesting, as white women, as white men. One student commented on a class evaluation that she wishes we had read works with or by feminists of other ethnicities, not just by Black women. This indicated to me how deeply gendered racism structures some students' perceptions of epistemic authority, something into which we have been educated in large part by their studies in philosophy. You can bet, and I will wager my shirt, that my colleague who teaches Edmund Husserl, right, a phenomenologist, or my other colleague who teaches John Rawls, or still a third who teaches Immanuel Kant, never has a student point out the parochialism of their course material, and having read those fellows, I can tell you they are paradigms of parochialism. That's one challenge of teaching intersectionality as a contribution of Black feminism, as opposed to this really mobile concept that is detached, right, from that original context of its articulation. Right, but bring it on, because its flip side is the brilliant student who told me that after completing a whole degree in philosophy, in my class on intersectionality, she finally saw herself reflected back to herself as an authoritative subject of knowledge. Intersectionality remains one of the best tools we have to authorize our students who are systematically excluded from the institutions and disciplines in which we teach. And although I've been focusing on philosophy, I would include women's and gender studies as a site of exclusion, to critique received categories of analysis of identity and of representation. So in closing, I just want to offer briefly some thoughts to the final question posed to us to guide our comments on this panel, and that is, what readings of intersectionality best contribute to anti-subordination practice? This question goes straight to the core of my motivations in engaging in any intellectual project. In my view, the intersectional readings which best position us to confront and challenge subordinating systems are those which reveal our implication and our positioning within these systems, in all its complexity, in all the complexity of that positioning, and which open up possibilities for connection and solidarity between us, despite our different positions. Such readings cannot take for granted those aspects of identities and those categories that are crafted through social dominance, but must be creative about the ways in which our resistance can reshape collective identities, transform social structures, and generate new ways of thinking. This requires us to be aware simultaneously of the ways in which we are positioned in hierarchical systems of dominance. And here I think it's important to use a phrase that I think Shireen Razak has written, that we keep a modernist eye on dominance, on hierarchy and dominance, and of the ways in which we can assert. So that's one prong. The other prong, the ways in which we can assert and reconfigure our interests and aspirations to collectively transform these systems. So in this connection, I'm always inspired by Audre Lorde's insight that I cannot be free while any other woman, any other person is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own. And I think intersectionality shows us that, or has the potential to show us that.
And Noah, Zatz.
Okay. Thanks. So it's a pleasure to be on this panel. One thing I'll add is, in addition to being on the faculty here in the law school, I'm also an advisory board member at the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment here at UCLA, which is very proud to be a presenting co-sponsor of this event. One of the reasons it's sort of neat for me to be here is that Kimberly Crenshaw's path-breaking work on intersectionality was actually a big influence on me when I was in college, both intellectually and in instilling the idea in me that it might be worthwhile to spend some of my time as a legal scholar. Although my own research on social welfare policy and on labor policy engages intersectionality at a number of points, I think the reason that I'm on the panel is to talk sort of more narrowly about how I teach intersectionality in my sort of much broader doctrinal course on employment discrimination law, sort of very different kind of context than the kind of place where intersectionality is the frame for the entire enterprise. So for me, how I do that and why I care about doing it harks back to that early excitement that I had at Kim's work, as well as the large and vibrant body of feminist and anti-racist scholarship that was being produced in the Legal Academy around that time. That work struck me deeply, in part because it was deeply engaged with and contributing to broader enterprises in social theory, and it was also had very concrete things to say about major legal and policy disputes of the day. So in that vein, the main goals that I have in teaching intersectionality, like all bodies of theory that I try to teach in my sort of so-called black letter classes, is, in addition to the specific content, also more generally to try to encourage students to think about how legal theory can make a difference and how legal arguments are constructed, including legal arguments that might actually be recognized by courts. And then second, in the other direction, how struggling with a series of very concrete, minute, sometimes technical problems can actually be generative of theoretical insights as you try to figure out what's really wrong here and what we would need to theorize in order to articulate what was wrong, in addition to just being frustrated, which is a perfectly legitimate starting point. So what I'm going to do is just sort of try to walk through very briefly how I structure my class on intersectionality, and this is, sort of very basic. this is something that I do in the course of a single session in a longer course, although I then try to link it back and have people read the rest of the course through that lens. So I'm going to try to be brief, and I fear I'm going to be quite boring to people who have sophisticated views about the area, but maybe it's a useful starting point for the pedagogical discussion. And then eventually I'll get to a bonus Justice Sotomayor tie-in later on. Okay, so in keeping with the sort of optimistic spirit of the sort of first remarks I made, I teach the doctrinal materials on intersectionality in a way that kind of has an opposite tenor from the cases that were highlighted in Kim's Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex piece, which was sort of overtly critical in its orientation. The cases I assign get it at least roughly right, which is to say, most crudely, that the women of color win, who are the plaintiffs in these cases. And what I'm sort of trying to do is to, in conjunction with having assigned Crenshaw's work, sort of provide a language for why those cases might be right, or at least partly right, or at least gesturing towards right. So I think and that's in part because I think for law students, it's helpful to leaven critical perspectives with at least some liberal reformism that keeps them coming back. So the first case that I teach is Jeffries versus Harris County Community Action Association. Quite an old case, actually, from 1980, which is essentially the opposite of the notorious DeGraff and Reed opinion that Crenshaw criticizes in the article. And this was a case where the plaintiff was a black woman who was passed over for promotion and claimed race and sex discrimination. And her sort of factual problem within the doctrine was that plenty of women had held the position that she was seeking, and plenty of African Americans had held it as well. But her point was that, right, as is the slogan, all of those women were white and all of those African Americans were men. Okay? So technically what this case is about, and this is why it works well in a technical course, is that it's all about the structure of comparison. And the structure of comparison is the primary form of reasoning that you see in Title VII anti-discrimination cases that are about firing, hiring, and promotion. The employer wants to show that people like the plaintiff had been treated well, and that the bad outcome for her in this case was about something idiosyncratic to her, not part of a larger structural problem. And then the flip side, the employee wants to show that the people who've been treated well were different in the ways that Title VII is concerned about. Primarily race and sex in this context. So Jeffries held that discrimination against black women could exist even in the absence of evidence of discrimination against black men and white women. So I then used that kind of brute outcome to probe the distinction between two different ways that you can conceptualize intersectionality, both of which are present in Crenshaw's piece, one which is sometimes called double discrimination, the other which is sometimes called compound discrimination. So on a double discrimination theory, you could get facts like Jeffries. If speaking highly schematically, as I think is sometimes useful, you imagine a scenario where someone would be denied a promotion if they had two strikes against them. White women and black men might have one strike against them, but that wasn't enough to get them not to get them promoted. But the black women would get screened out because they had two. Right? That's the sort of double discrimination context. It's summing up separate dimensions of race and sex, where those are grounded in the experience of black men on the one hand and white women on the other. But on a compound discrimination, you could again get facts like what we see in Jeffries if the strikes against black women were more than simply the sum of those against black men or white women, such that a black woman could, again, just schematically get one strike even though no one else got any, or get three strikes even though no one else got more than one, and so forth. So this is in part sort of probing into intersectionality and also showing the ambiguity of the case relative to the theory. Now, I think that theoretically the most exciting thing about Crenshaw's work, and this goes to, I think, the transitional concept notion perhaps, the most exciting thing was to conceptualize race and sex not simply as independent fields that occasionally collide, right, but as a more kind of continuously variable race-sex complex in which the race and gender position of black women was not simply derivative of race as exemplified by black men or sex as exemplified by white women. But the problem here is that that move can also be flipped in the legal context that we're studying at, and so that's something I want to sort of push the students to think through. If you have a variation on a case like Jeffries, in which there was evidence of discrimination against white women, and there was evidence of discrimination against black men, but there was no evidence one way or the other about other black women, where does that leave us? If you think about radical discontinuity among the various race-sex configuration, then intersectionality could in fact be turned against the black female plaintiff in that case by saying it's not relevant to black women what happens to white women. It's not relevant to what happens to black women, what happens to black men. Now, of course, Crenshaw quite clearly anticipated this in her article, and indeed takes pains to criticize it through her analysis of class action cases, in which courts refused to let black women stand in as representatives for African Americans generally or women generally, but not vice versa. Of course, black men could always stand in for black women and so forth. So all of this, right, suggests, I think, a more general point, which is that the operation of race and sex varies not just by the configuration of the identities of the individuals at stake, but also by other kinds of contexts, which is to say intersectionality can happen in different ways in different moments. I think it also suggests the importance of thinking about intersectionality not only in the circumstances of women of color in which it was generated, but also more generally. In particular, I at this point invite students to think about the possibility that in some circumstances black men face discrimination that's partly constituted by their being men, not simply despite their being men. Rather than thinking about masculinity always as a source of relative privilege, there might be ways in which the masculinity, the complex of masculinity and blackness actually works in a disadvantageous way in a particular context. And then similarly for white women. And that's where I then invite students to revisit issues that we had previously thought about in the course that was about race, when in fact it was about race as lived out in the experience of black men, sometimes particularly, for instance, in work that I do on incarceration, and then vice versa. Additionally, just to kind of tweak them a little bit, if that's right, if you need to think about masculinity in order to understand the full dimensions in which black men sometimes suffer racism, then it complicates the skepticism that my progressive students typically have about the value of so-called reverse discrimination claims, right? Because it matters, because that's a situation in which thinking about the position of someone as a man might be in furtherance not of a kind of conservative backlash view about the way white men suffer from affirmative action, but it might help us capture what's going on in the experience of black men. So you don't want then to have an across-the-board dismissal about thinking about symmetry in employment discrimination law. So this is the point at which they start to rethink, I think, the whole course. The second case that I teach is more recent and involves harassment. This is Cruz versus Coach Stores from 2000. Here, the problem is not one of evidence, because as is true for many of the hostile work environment cases that get this far, there's lots of overtly racialized and gendered conduct and commentary that were targeted against the plaintiff, who's a Latina salesperson. The problem in this case is, as with many harassment cases, essentially how bad was it, right? How much difficulty do the various aspects of the workplace add up to? That's the technical doctrinal problem. So one way to frame the problem of the analysis is to start out by categorizing each event as involving either race or sex. And if you start there, then the pro-plaintiff approach is going to be to allow graciously the plaintiff to aggregate all of these different incidents, even though some of them involve race and some of them involve sex. Right? So you add them all up and see how big the total is. Now, in some ways, that seems ambitious because it requires courts to say that it wasn't enough that there be race discrimination and it wasn't enough that there be sex discrimination, but nonetheless, without either of those things, there'll be a cause of action. And we can still sort of limp over the line. The 10th Circuit actually took that position in another case, but the court in Cruz didn't want to go there. So it seemed like the court in Cruz was being quite cautious. Instead, the court emphasized, quote, the interplay between the two forms of harassment, end quote, reasoning that, quote, racial harassment exacerbated the effects of the sexually threatening behavior and vice versa. Now, that passage is, of course, quite ambiguous. You could read it in a variety of different ways. But I think it's consistent with a theoretical position in which race and sex should not be separated and then added together, but instead that gender is always thoroughly racialized and vice versa. Now, one of the reasons why you might care about that and why that might matter is that although race and sex are both protected under Title VII, which was the doctrinal context in which Crenshaw's work began, just as examples, age and disability have their own separate statutes, and someday soon that may be true for sexual orientation as well. So these theoretical questions about aggregation versus mutual kind of constitution can actually be quite important, again, just at a sort of pedestrian technical level when we navigate intersections beyond race and sex, because race and sex appear next to each other in Title VII, but if you want to do race and age or race and disability, you have a kind of different technical problem. So through this case, what I'm doing is I'm encouraging students to see a court that's ritually performing a certain kind of restraint while arguably laying the groundwork for a more radical account of race and sex discrimination. So that's the sort of thing that one might hope for from a wise Latina judge. And in fact, then judge and now Justice Sotomayor was the author of the Cruz opinion. So I'll stop there and happy to elaborate in the Q&A.
Now, I did promise the panelists that they could actually question or discuss something with each other if there's anything in the remarks that were made today that you want to ask each other for elaboration, etc. And I actually kind of wanted a concrete example of what Barbara was talking about in the sense of the do aspect, that you do disrupt the student's ability to use certain rhetorical modes. How?
I say that I don't allow in the graduate seminar that my impression is that graduate seminars are often places where students establish their intellectual authority by making reference to things that are not shared with the rest of the class, by calling on knowledge that other students. When you have an interdisciplinary class that draws from 19 departments, it's almost inevitable some of them will have more expertise than others in a particular topic. My impression is that many graduate students position themselves as authorities by withholding that information from the other graduate students. I require all of our discussion to be about the texts. This requires me to pick really good texts that do a really good job, and I'm really good at it. For my undergraduate class, when I discovered the staging of agency in Girls Gone Wild, which shows a very good way that neoliberal theories frame the notion that I am free to show my breasts to you, and therefore it's actually anti-feminist to critique me in any way. It was a great moment. But in the graduate classes, I've tended to move toward texts, clusters of texts talking about a specific thinker, and sometimes we read a little bit of the thinker. Once we did a whole seminar on Judith Butler. I've done that twice actually, but an example would be Agamben's State of Exception. We read a little bit of the State of Exception, and then we read 4 other people trying to use the State of Exception. For instance, Geraldine Pratt uses the State of Exception to talk about the situation of 2 different groups in Canada, Filipino nannies brought over and then in effect treated like servants, like slaves in the home, not given privileges, and women classified as sex workers who are then murdered. And then I used something that Coco Fusco did using Agamben. And so we'll be reading a cluster of people who are all taking a theory, thinking with it, and using it for their own purposes. And so if somebody starts talking about not liking a text, I just say we don't do that. And I actually I'm not in the slightest bit interested in hearing whether someone, I mean, yes, I want them to enjoy the texts, but, the fact that
I care more if they like my jacket.
we sometimes act as though the fact that a student finds words hard to understand in a text, and I'm thinking about Butler, people complain about her language, and then we're supposed to say, I'm sorry, but if you have work to do, then you've got to do the work that your work requires, and that means you've got to go ahead and come to grips with it.
Thanks. This is your free-for-all.
I would be happy to hear what people
Yeah.
to say.
Okay. Well, turn to the audience. There are microphones on the side to make it easier to hear the questions, and I'll try to repeat them if we can't. And in the meantime, while you're thinking about your question, I will reminisce a bit. Since Kim Crenshaw and I were in part of the same symposium when she gave the talk that later became published as Demarginalizing the Intersection. At that symposium at the University of Chicago, it just so happened that Richard Posner was on the same panel that I was. We had a panel that was representing supposedly liberal feminism, radical feminism, and conservative feminism. Wendy Williams from Georgetown was representing liberal feminism, did a great job. Richard Posner was representing conservative feminism, and I didn't know this ahead of time, but I was representing radical feminism. Because I wanted to talk about the fact that what's now referred to as domestic violence was then referred to as the problem of battered women instead of the problem of violent husbands. And Posner explained that of course, was an intractable problem, so he wouldn't have anything to say about that. And took on Wendy Williams, who, in language that was... Wendy Williams accused him of using language as a bludgeon. And in fact, several of the economists in the audience said, yes, your language is pretty... You're not just using economist language, you're using particular economist language. And I found that very interesting. I also found interesting that Posner, as part of his presentation, told us that from the perspective of a woman, surrogacy was a 9-month rental of her womb. And I wondered how many women he had talked to come to this conclusion, since at that point I had talked to probably over 50 women about how they considered surrogacy either as the intending mother or as the birth mother, and not one of them had ever mentioned anything about renting a womb. But that was from a woman's perspective. It made me wonder about the notion about who gets authority to speak and in what way about whose experience, that it would be foreign to him to think about whether discrimination, whether violence in the home was a problem, of battered women, something wrong with them, something wrong with us, or a problem of violence against us. But it would seem quite natural for him to think of birth, gestation and birth as in rental terms. Anyway, and Kim was in that same symposium. Her talk was just as controversial at the time, and she referred to it as not fully worked out, but sort of muddling through, and then devastated the room. So these are the claims to authority and lack of authority that we make on a regular basis, and they don't always match the reality. Okay, I gave you time. Now you got some questions, right?
Actually, this is for Anna, but the rest of you should feel free to just chime in. I liked your remarks about seeing intersectionality as a transitional concept that does repair work, and we're both philosophers, so I wanted to ask you, first of all, what kind of repair work do you think intersectionality can do for us? And second, why do you think philosophy as a discipline has been so resistant to this concept, which I think both of us will agree is really helpful and something that we need?
Well, I borrow that phrase actually from Kimberly Crenshaw, transitional concept. And the sense in which I think she means it and the sense in which I used it was that intersectionality is a critique of categories, right? So we see lots of deployments of intersectionality that reproduce those same categories and that in some cases reify them in ways that I think are kind of problematic. But I take the entire force of intersectionality as a metaphor to be a critique of the categories we use and of those people who are systematically excluded from those categories, right? As visible or as paradigmatic representatives of those categories. So categories of race, of gender, and so on. And I think it's important to teach it as a transitional concept that has also undergone some transformations because it doesn't recommit us to redeploying the categories that it sets out to critique, right? And so one thing that I try to do in a course on intersectionality is to show how in Crenshaw's own work, in my view, but also in its deployments in lots of different disciplines, the meaning of intersectionality has shifted. In some cases from this sort of critical meaning to having some kind of positive valence and even acting as a theory or as a positive concept of oppression, right? And I think that it's important to be attuned to those shifts because they tell us something important about the work that we need to do and the desires that we project onto the concept or the term intersectionality. Why it's not really been taken up in philosophy, I think it's just because of whom philosophers will read and what kinds of questions they will consider. I mean, maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but that seems to me to be, one major factor. I mean, what do you think?
Oh, I think it's cultural too. I think intersectionality's got this wonderful, muddiness to it that makes it very flexible and very fruitful. And I think philosophers tend to, we like our concepts neat and orderly, and it annoys us. And to do that, as Naomi Zatz would say, would be taking philosophy in a new direction. And I think a lot of people culturally in philosophy are uncomfortable with this direction that it takes us. It also challenges, the whiteness and the white supremacy of our discipline, which is unbearably white.
Is that an issue about analytical philosophy, or does it apply to continental as well?
Continentals are much better. They're much more open to these sorts of tools.
After all, a lot of the continental philosophers that we deal with were women. And not always white. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure.
I'm teaching ethics studies courses, and in the ethics study field, usually we teach introduction course is mostly historically oriented and then identity-based content, and then intersectionality being introduced to ethics studies, of course, on a few campuses. And I'm from Hamilton State. I'm just trying to, push intersectionality into my course, especially introduction course. I find it's challenging I lack of kind of strategies to teach introduction level students, mostly white students, labeled as white, but it's really problematic because students' body is a lot of people you can see, in traditional perspective in public, but perceived as white, but a lot of students not really white, identify them as white, and some of the minority students identify as a white. So I'm now teaching Peyton's book about, this book very popular, White, Black Kids Sitting Together, and also with the Tapiaki's textbook, Different Mirror. I felt it's very challenging. How can we teach intersectionality concept into introduction level courses such as ethics studies? I felt like we're overemphasizing how institutionalized advantages are based on race, which is Peyton's definition. So we all recognize that institutionally race is based on institutional advantages. But yet there's so many phenomena existing now. So how can we deal with these things with student challenges? Say we are not white, but defined as white. And the reality seems like white as a category is already being stigmatized. So how can we all challenging all these kind of things? Legally, certain people define as white, like Jewish and also Arab, and then a lot of students assuming they're not white, but legally they are white. All these differences is really challenging to instructors to teach. So I just want to get any advice in terms of textbooks and in terms of strategies in the classroom.
Were people able to hear, this is specifically about introductory courses and teaching introductory courses in ethnic studies. Are there helps in bringing intersectionality into that, particularly, I would put it in the context of real contestation about identities and about what counts as a racialized identity and what is the invisible or unmarked category. Anybody? Suggestions for the introduction of the concept?
I'm going to dodge by saying I'm the only one here who doesn't teach undergrads.
Well, I teach lots of undergrads, and many of them at the same time. So I have something to say about it. I mean, I teach this introductory, well, it's not an introductory level class, it's a 300 level class, but it's a general elective. In a theme, they're organized in themes at Cal State. That's called Gender and the Diversity of Human Experience. So it's already an intersectional theme, and the people who designed it had that in mind. So the class is called, I think, something like Philosophy, Gender, and Culture, but I renamed it Feminist Theories of Gender, Race, and Class. And it is, what you talk about is a big challenge. The most common response is that it's too complicated to hold everything at once. I see lots of people nodding, so I take it that everyone has heard this. It's too complicated to hold everything at once, and how is it possible to actually attack all these fronts? So the normative problem stemming from that descriptive problem, right? And so one thing that I found useful is actually to describe it, sort of interlocking macrological structures rather than approach it from the point of view of individual, or even group experiences construed as sort of individual experiences a little bit, So I'm, talking about my individual experience and that substitutes for a group experience. And instead to focus on macrological political structures. And so the capstone theme in that course is war, and thinking about anti-war feminism as an approach that can take a kind of interlocking analysis of systems of militarism, which are racist and misogynistic, of capitalism, of colonialism, and imperialist occupation. So I found that sort of brings things together for students, but unfortunately it doesn't happen until the end of the class. And one really excellent essay that I found that I assign to talk about war is Hubin Amy Chu's essay. I don't know how many people have read it. She was an undergraduate student at Harvard when she wrote the essay called Occupation is Not Women's Liberation, which targets sort of pseudo-feminist imperialist arguments for war and for occupation. It was written in 2005, just after the invasion of Iraq. So in that sense, students are able to see that there's this sort of system that implicates us all and that we're all situated within, and that many people have really complex relationships to. And also that many people have certain kinds of aspirational identities that aren't really described by their situated identities, right? So one thing that she talks about in that essay is how feminists who deploy these imperialist arguments actually aspire to have an identity that makes them be reflected in the state in certain ways that run counter to and maybe mitigate some of the ways in which they're excluded as women, say. Right, so I don't know. It's a very big problem.
Got a couple more here first, and then down here. Yeah.
So I wonder if, especially Barbara and Anna, if you could respond to this, because I've been teaching intersectionality. I always think that I need to embed it somehow in theories or thinking about what is power. Or in thinking about what is inequality and how is it made in society. So for me, if I have to teach it, I have to believe it. Also, so I use theories there that I feel at easy because I think they work, which is on power. Also, Foucault, it needs to have some Foucaultian something. Otherwise, I don't think you could really teach anything on intersectionality. And when it comes to inequality, I like very much Charles Tilly's work. He has a book on durable inequality, which is on mechanisms of categorization as essential to inequalities, which is a gender studies idea, but he embeds it in a broader social theory, which makes it easier to translate to non-feminist students or students who do not identify as them. So I wonder what kind of experience you have of embedding this teaching of intersectionality and whether, if you have this experience, what kind of other theories you feel are like necessary. It is not an introductory course that we have this knowledge before, or it is one course that you embedded in that course.
Okay. Barbara, you want to start with that?
Well, a good amount of my teaching, sometimes twice a year, always at least once a year, is the first of a 3-quarter sequence we have for feminist studies majors. And we call my course Feminist Analysis, and it's followed by feminist theories and then by feminist methodologies. And this is like totally created for the way I think, because what I try to do in feminist analysis is turn them into people who will see what a theory does for an argument, why somebody would use an argument. And to do this, I have, first of all, I should explain, I think this is important. Every single reading, they have to either pass a quiz, taking the question again and again until they pass it, or write what I call a writing event, which is not a paper, but an answer to the questions: what is the main argument? What is the theory being used? How is the theory being used? And so on. Because what I want them to see is that there are things being deployed there for certain achievements. And then, and to me, this is of course one of the wonderful things that intersectionality gives us. It means that the tendency that some students have of wanting to see themselves as often white females mirrored in everything they read, I can totally disregard and do totally disregard. But it's a little awkward because actually at UCSB is getting very close to being, there's some term about Hispanic serving campus, which is like 35 or 40% of the students being Hispanic. I would say at least half of the feminist studies majors are women of color. So that part's very easy. What I do then is I don't think like them because I can't think like a 20-year-old. In fact, it's really frightening if you think about it. But I try to give them arguments that are topical to the conditions that they live in. And I was telling Rebecca Wanzo that I used her piece. She had a really accessible piece for students about the different ways that media treats girls who disappear if they are girls of color, as opposed to being white, blonde, middle class, pure girls who can be found innocent. And I look for arguments like that. I had what I felt was a very successful piece where Sharon Hijin Lee examines the discourse of Oprah around the world shows and demonstrates that Oprah positions herself as a neoliberal subject, which means they have to learn what neoliberalism is, and that's a great thing, positions herself as the ideal neoliberal subject, and discusses the cosmetic surgery of South Korean women totally differently than the way she discusses the cosmetic surgery of Brazilian women and American women. So, for instance, Brazilian women are just natural, so of course they work on their butts because they want to dance. I say butts because it says butts. I know that's a bad word. The South Korean women, they're very concerned about because they're self-hating. They do the eye surgery, and there's even an inference that it's like racial self-hatred, and so Oprah doesn't approve of it, and also that they even aren't good mothers, because if you're spending your money on cosmetic surgery, you're not a good mother. And so it's totally racialized, and interestingly enough, I don't know how this happens, but the white women, you know, some are too big, some are too small, some don't do it right one way, some don't do it. The white women do it just right. They go to Brazil and have things done, thereby combining a cheap cosmetic job with a vacation, and therefore they are, it's a peak experience. So there are a lot of articles about that. As long as you keep your eye out for something known to young women because it's in a general public discourse, and as you can see, I'm doing discourse analysis. I'm teaching them to do discourse analysis. It brings in a theory, either a feminist theory or another kind of theory like neoliberalism, which I think they take for granted notions like you're responsible for yourself and have to be an entrepreneur of your body, and so that's helpful to call that into question. And then race, usually. So I have a number of those running through the course. So there's a way in which we're always talking about race. We're never talking about our race. And I didn't know if that's what you were thinking about your ethnic studies class. I know people can, but the way I do my class is I'm trying to give them tools to argue with other people, and I make that very clear, and I list off the names of the people they could argue with. They have trouble with men in bars who think that they're, man-haters because they're feminist studies majors. They have trouble with their relatives who tell them they should behave in certain ways. So I never ask anyone if she's a feminist. I never ask anyone what her ethnicity is. I don't ask them if they feel the way the people. In other words, one of the moves of power is to make people think. People who, in one case, are in a position of power usually don't feel that they're in a position of power. So for them to tell you that they don't feel powerful, yes, they know they're white, but that doesn't make them feel powerful. This is not an advancement in the discussion because you had never, in fact, said white people feel the pain of being privileged. So I pick
Barbara, can I
public arguments.
I also want to point out that, Kim's original article was timely in the sense of looking at the media campaign that was happening right then that was specifically excluding black mothers as potential sites of strength and pathologizing them. So she was doing the same kind of thing of bringing in a media campaign that was right there, that everyone would have been familiar with. So it was taking what could otherwise be a relatively difficult concept for non-lawyers to understand. As Noah described the legal moves very accessibly. I want to take your class. But that a lay audience could understand through the analysis of the way that the media campaign was being handled at that time. So that combination of mainstream media culture and sort of esoteric or cabined off knowledge is in the original. I'm just going to move ahead because we have a couple more questions right here. Yes, ma'am.
I'll be quick because we talked about this, but I do teach introductory studies. I teach African American feminist thought and African American feminist literary thought at a book calls itself a small selective liberal arts college.
Emphasis on the selective, right?
In northern New England.
Okay.
That sometimes I am the only person of color in the course. So that the business about me is not the issue. It is, as you have suggested, always about the text. I say there's an evangelist, Freddie Price, who holds the Bible in his hand. And it's always, and so when we move from the text, I said I feel Freddie Price possesses it. And so we always stay in the text. But I remind them, one, that it's really quite difficult. In fact, I think impossible to think about those discursive formations that intersect or imbricate, is my word, at the same time. That you always have to think about them you look upon the body of that text, which is a woman, I bet you can't guess what my major was before this, but that text that is whatever it is, a gendered body, a racialized body, a body with class. And so discourse is a really very, very good term. It is always incomplete. It hides its inconclusion. It is about what we think we know, and therefore we articulate what we know. And I think it is stone. And it moves, as does the theory of intersectionality, across time and space. Gender is the same way. And so I always talk, in fact, about a trip I took to the Dominican Republic, where suddenly I was not a black person anymore. And it seemed to me, and I said, now clearly you know I don't present myself that way here. So what do we know about race, about my airplane trip to give a paper in Santo Domingo? If it is that mobile, then we are not talking about it as concrete in stone. Transitional is exactly what it is. It is, intersectionality is a technology for me.
Did you want to say something about that?
Well, I find that really interesting. Maybe we can let other people
Yeah, thank you.
talk. Yeah, thank you.
Back in the back, yes.
I've got comments about the other two commentators. First, I want to say, I sort of smiled when I heard you say you have to use Foucault to talk about power, which I use Foucault a lot, but I have a colleague who's a political scientist, and then about every year she teaches graduate class, she calls me at some point, she says, girl, I have these great essays from political scientists and sociologists about power and the ways it's worked, and then I teach in the women's studies department, and all the women's studies students say, well, you can't really talk about power without using Foucault. So one of the things I think is interesting to think about, which I'd be interested in the panel discussing, are the interdisciplinary challenges of talking about intersectionality, that they're actually very different approaches. Like political scientists, the number I know would say, yes, you can absolutely talk about power without talking about historians. So I think that's an interesting question that all the panel could address. But I also want to go back to your question way back, where I think you wanted like 101 privilege, right? So there are a couple of essays, obviously the old school unpacking the racial knapsack, right? Then there's the updated the Carbato essay from Black Group Studies about heterosexuality. There's also one that I'm blocking in my head that does the same thing about privilege, about ability and disability. I can't think of it right now. And so in our Women's Studies 101, all of our students do that, and they use their own bodies as well as their students' bodies. Like their bodies have to be present to talk about privilege. So the privilege essays are the ways that people who say, I'm not white, or I'm not privileged. That's usually how we do address it in our process.
Yeah, because part of it is the slippage about what does the term power mean. That was what, and that's one of the reasons why we have such a disidentification with it, is that we have a certain idea about what power means, and I don't have it, right? But we may be able to recognize privilege as something that you have at particular times and places. So I think it's useful to switch from the language of power to the language of privilege when you're trying to, particularly in the introductory area. And I can talk a lot about power without using Foucault, but
Without thinking it?
but not without thinking about it. You're right. Okay. Should we just move on with statements, or do you want to chime in whenever you want to? Otherwise, we'll hear from people, because we've got a lot of people to hear from. Over here, and then there, and then there. So, Laura, yes, you.
I'm sort of hearing this thread of sticking to the text, which I think is really important toward a pedagogical move. But I'm a little concerned about, part of the critical race theory also is this, that we want experiential theorizing, right? Personal theorizing. And that was one of that's a core method of critical race theory, is sort of incorporating the personal. So I'm wondering if there's other pedagogical techniques that you use as well as sticking to the text, journals, or something to make sure that our students do have this experience in the classroom where their voices are heard about who they are, and they're trying to process it. So a way of controlling, that getting out of control. But then also using other pedagogical techniques to really, this is a different pedagogical space, and I do want you to have that personal theorizing and recognize that as a valuable epistemology.
Well, I mean, one thing I'll say on that, and this I think goes in part back to the power question that's been raised in a number of ways. So when I'm teaching a kind of doctrinal law class, and it's power that's speaking in the judicial opinions, that's a place where part of the point is to get students, on the one hand, to figure out how to enter that conversation, but also not to take it as the entire be-all and end-all. So I think it would be disastrous to stick to the text when what text you're reading, right, are judicial opinions. So I mean, so that's in part about the different places that we're starting with in terms of classroom materials. I mean, one way to do that concretely that I do is to, I assign Kimberly Crenshaw's work when we're reading some judicial opinions. And so part of it is about, one thing that you can do is getting, cross encounters between texts, right, some of which students will feel more identified with and others which they won't. And that's, I think, also a way of having it not be strictly the personal, right? It's the personal which is in identification with something that's more structural, which I think can be a helpful way to bridge those. And just as a pure classroom technique matter, I will also, suggest people come up with examples of things, right? So that's, what is implicit here? Here's a theoretical possibility, right? So I'll draw out the theoretical possibility of thinking about intersectionality in terms of black men. Or white women, and then I'll ask students to come up with examples, and that lets them, on the one hand, possibly think from experience, on the other hand, distance themselves a little bit if that's the easier thing to do in the environment. So that's just a sort of very concrete example.
I often ask students, how do you think your life would be different if you were of the other gender or of another gender? But I let them answer that anonymously. So, and then I take their answers and shuffle them like a deck of cards, pass them back out so they have to read them, but then nobody knows whose they are. So you are identifying with somebody else's words on the page in your voice, but it's not you. It's not you. And I also do role playing where I hand out cards. Here's your role for today. Today you're going to think about how to build a battered women's shelter, but from the perspective of women who don't speak English. Or from the perspective of this, Beef Sedgwick can have a subject position as a gay man, then I can have a subject position of a woman who doesn't speak English.
I think you're right that it's not just about sticking to the text, but actually engaging the text in some way that is reflective as well, right? So in my introductory level class, I assign a reflection paper rather than a standard, argumentative philosophical paper as their major assignment, in which I ask them to engage, 3 concepts that we introduced in the class to talk about some aspect of their own lived experience. And this is interesting for me because one of the questions that students ask is what counts as my experience, and can I talk about something that I observe, or does this have to be something that has happened to me? And the people who most often ask this question are people who also say, I don't see myself in the text that you've assigned. And what they mean by that is, I don't see myself in the texts that discuss oppression that you've assigned. And so it's majoritively the few white men in my class that will ask this question. I teach at a university that's majoritively Latino-Latina students. And I always want to say, no, talk about something that has happened to you, because that's, sort of what's motivating the question, right? But it's interesting because it's true that we can think of the exercise of reflection as something much broader than just giving examples from my own direct experience, right? because then we get into talking about relationships and implication and so on and so forth, right? But this desire not to situate themselves vis-a-vis the material that we're reading is really, really dominant. So, yeah.
Reminds me of Art Leonard
can
telling
I-
people that
yeah,
you
before
you
we
also
move-
have a sexual orientation. It's not a code word for being gay. You know that everybody has a sexual orientation, whether you think about it or not. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know. I just wanted to make sure, since I don't agree with you, I would like to be sure I have a chance to say so. I think that in the total available space of a major, there should be room for that. It sort of nauseates me, actually, and so I don't want to be the one to do it. I worry that our students of color and our feminist studies majors leave the university unable to make the arguments that they have to make to change social structures, to live in social structures. I constantly am talking to students who don't know how to argue with their dad about affirmative action. They know they believe in it, but they don't have the tools to argue about it. Also, part of what I talked about in the book I finished and did the index to, and will soon have right in front of you, is that there's a cultural training program already going on that trains students what the world is like. And if you don't teach them how to deal with that, then you're severely limiting them. I don't think of my class as a safe space, and despite all my posturing, my students think I'm very nice to them, and they write me emails saying, oh, I have to talk to you tomorrow because my mother-in-law told me last night I was crazy, and what are we going to do? And, you know, my office hours are a safe space, but the class itself is a space where we try to figure out what discursive tools we have to fight back. Not just to be who we already are, but to fight back so we can be what we want to be.
Over here.
I struggle to incorporate this sometimes in law teaching because despite the fact that Kim Crenshaw wrote in law reviews, a lot of these ideas are as not accepted in legal environments as they are in philosophy. So I think students who sort of roll their eyes and wonder where the law is, how do you get buy-in? So I guess specifically for Noah, but for you know, how do we get buy-in when students say that's more useless theory, please teach me some black letter law? How do you get people to not just buy in, but then possibly expand on these arguments in ways that maybe change the environment for black letter law?
Ah, Noah.
Well, I mean, I don't know whether I'm successful at it, although, I mean, I'd like to think I am at least a non-trivial amount of time. And I guess one of the things that I do just at a very concrete level is I always assign texts that are recognizable to the students as law in conjunction with secondary material, and I work hard to get them to without invoking the theory, to get them to see that there's a problem or something that seems not quite right with what's explicitly contained within those authoritative legal texts. And then, how handy, you know, stage left is some theoretical material that kind of gives a language with which to talk about something that they might be troubled by in the text. So I mean that's kind of abstract, but as a practical matter, that's how I do it. I never start with the theory and then ask them to apply it, because I think that raises the hackles that you're describing, even though in a different kind of classroom that might be quite successful. I kind of create problems on the ground and then help them think with theory to make sense of it. So that's my general strategy.
I like that approach. I use war stories. I mean, my own legal practice stories, but I don't have an unbroken string of wins. So, so sometimes I run out of my stories and I borrow other people's. But I like that particular strategy too, of starting with the problem and then seeing how the theory helps you deal with the problem. You were next. Yes, ma'am.
I actually wanted to chime in a little bit more about this kind of sticking to the text, and actually as, sorry, how do I say your last name?
Just call me Anna, please. Yeah.
In your syllabus on issues in feminist philosophy, under course policies, there's a section on anti-oppression, right? And it kind of describes, what is tolerated and what isn't tolerated in the classroom. And I think when I think about this idea of sticking to the text, that I've been in plenty of classrooms where people completely distance themselves and feel like I can have a really good conversation about the text and that's academia. But if I get into bringing myself into the space, or if somebody asks me to bring myself into the space, then that's not rigorous. That's just talking about ourselves. And so I wonder how in your classroom this process looks, and I also want to frame that in this idea of students as consumers and evaluations, because that plays out, right?
Yes, it does. Yeah. So I don't know if it's attached to that syllabus, but I also hand out a list of guidelines for participation, because inevitably students will ask, I do assess participation, and inevitably students will ask, well, how do you assess participation? And so, I hand out a set of guidelines as to what constitutes, productive participation in a classroom discussion, right? And I struggle with this question of assessment as well, and I get them to do a sort of self-assessment at the end of class, and I sort of compare my assessment to their assessment and sort of come up with some kind of really not very objective measure of their participation. The anti-oppression statement serves as an agreement more than a rule I impose. In practice, it has, and I've been happy that has happened. So I've never had to sort of refer to it as, well, you're violating, the policy on anti-oppression in that respect, right? And I think I say something on it like, this is, to be construed as a commitment to a process, right? So I ground it in sort of a basic value of respect, mutual respect, rather than, some sort of form of censorship in the name of political correctness. I think it actually encourages students to speak about their own experiences as those are situated within these relations of oppression, because first of all, it names it as occurring and as potentially occurring in the classroom, and as a danger that ends up, excluding people, making people feel badly, and so on, right? And so I feel like it helps students feel like there's some kind of recourse that they have, in an instance where, some classmate is saying something that offends them, to sort of challenge what they're saying, not necessarily to shut it down, but to challenge what they're saying. And I actually get students, divulging sort of aspects of their personal experiences, and connecting those to the text more, I think, than if I wasn't actually stating outright that, we need to be respectful of one another, and not assume, things like that this person who's speaking is the representative of a particular group, and ought to be treated as the representative, or dismissed as the representative of a particular group, that all of these things are not necessarily visible or audible to us in the moment, that we aren't always aware of the importance and the significance of our own experiences, and may, belatedly, as a result of conversation, come to some kind of awareness of these, right? So I think it's important to use experience as a rich sort of terrain, but not to sort of use it as a form of validation of particular claims, right? Because it itself needs to be theorized and explained and contested by other people. And so, one of the experiences in teaching intersectionality that, often I hear in the class is, of reverse discrimination, right? And so if we were to use this notion of experience as validation, right, then we would have to consider seriously, this claim of reverse discrimination, which is an experience that people have. It's an imagined experience, but it is an experience that they have, right? As somehow, something we need to engage with that defeats some kind of, claim of justice. So, I agree with you that, part of what the challenge is here is to show that these texts, so in philosophy, these canonical texts are based on experience, right? Even when we see them as, these authoritative texts. And, I don't think that's something that needs to be excluded from classrooms.
I'd like to push that a little more. It's sometimes, there aren't rules about teaching that work for all purposes. My focus on the text grew out of a writing program that I ran for 25 years at UC San Diego, and the strength of my influence on them was apparently evident when you looked at the proportion of people who voted for Schwarzenegger, and in San Diego area it was a huge proportion, so I thought, my God, they couldn't have paid attention. But we were in a situation where starting about 1987 or 1990, it has different writing programs, and two of the writing programs were run the way mine was, where I selected and trained the TAs, and then they were in the classroom, and I only went to observe the day I evaluated them. The graduate students came from 10 departments and were often students of color and intended to teach social justice related courses. The students in the course were entering freshmen. We had a huge, the courses ran, there were 2 courses, and so in the fall, brand new TAs were dealing with really the level. It's not that I'm saying freshmen are animals, but it was really amazing what they thought was appropriate to do and say to their instructor. So here's an instructor who wants to learn to teach about social justice, and I wanted them to. The university promises to train you to teach that which you're getting your PhD in, and the students feel authorized, and I believe actually are authorized, to treat any readings required by people of color or women treated as women as though they are violations of a pact that we have. I had one student who wrote to his black instructor who taught a number of books, none by blacks, but he taught material by Asian Americans, and he did teach something by Michael Eric Dyson. And he was informed by the student that the student did not oppress or did not enslave his grandparents, so don't blame me. I shouldn't have to take this course without special ethnic studies credit. If you allowed the students to express their opinions of the text, they would repeat normal vicious slurs available in the media. Students of color, women students, did not particularly wish to share with such classmates their experiences. This was not only not a safe space, this was a real dangerous space for all of us. It was also a very dangerous space for me because faculty committees wondered aloud year after year whether I should be allowed to have the academic freedom to make white males read material by people of color and women that offended them. And I probably did my best writing in response to that committee. I wrote a 150-page rebuttal to their pickling on me about what we were doing. It was really good. It was very interdisciplinary, like they were social scientists, and I say, how could a committee composed of social scientists take the 4 people that were in their own classes that talked about this program and compare it to the 2,000 student evaluations that we collect normally as part of the program? To do that, this was, so I really can't overstate how dangerous a place this was for me and how dangerous it was to do this. But we tricked them. We insisted that TAs had a choice. Either you cannot critique the notions of the text ever, or your papers must explain the entire argument of the text. Then if you want to, you can add a paragraph critiquing it, which by then they usually couldn't support their critique anyway, so they give it up. So if you're thinking, oh, these people aren't able to talk about their true subjectivity, they did not want to talk about their subjectivity in front of people who would roll their eyes when they mentioned something about their sexuality.
I've got a couple more. Yes, you.
I have an anecdote and a question. And starts when you use the word engaging. First of all, I'm very excited. It's really for Shakespeare. And I'm looking to find words. Engaging. And now I'm looking for words. I was excited that you are here. Thank you. The words somewhere in Israel theorize what we carry up to that point intuitively. If you are suffering from a personal psychosis. And now that I know that I'm suffering from a very collective psychosis, so it is thank you. So you just have engaging. So the anecdote is I was interviewing once for a job, and the interviewer, who is interested in love enough, is Ashkenazi Jew in Israel. Ashkenazi Jews are white Jews, and I'm here goes the only Mizrahi scholars in Israel in law. Basically, if something happens to us, it's done in Israel. So, and in Israel, we're perceived to be black Jews. So, speaking of the question of what am I now, and why am I black, what am I here in America? But he used a sentence. He said, about my writing, he said, well, first of all, your writing is too feminist. And I said, yeah, I make omelet in a feminist way.
Not without breaking some eggs.
So this is where it ended. But then, speaking seriously now about a question, I just wanted to shift the focus from the students to the teachers themselves, especially with teachers that belong to the minority that they are representing, against the students that are the ones that are not really represented by my own representation. That is, I teach in a class that is basically me teaching me, and a class that is very resistant. Which puts me in a very cold place. Mm-hmm. And it's actually not a question, it's a cry for help in a way. We're becoming very conscious about the way we sound, the voice, my hair, the bracelets that I'm using, very provocative Jew, my earrings. And we always feel like they use a word, it's called pleja, which is a local English would be a ghetto girl. And this is the way they call us. I would go in the law school and they would say, how come, what is this, a mistake of nature? What is she doing here? We've been using this word. And Angela Davis said once, she said, everything that is written by a black woman is immediately demagogical, political, ideological, and we always sound like preachers and not real scholarship. And I'm just, even now I'm thinking, perhaps I sound too passionate. That is not professional. And that's very hard. That's it. I have to, it's like my psychologist session is ended.
And ours has just begun. I've just been handed a note asking us to stop just on time because we want to invite the audience to the opening reception, which is to be held right out here in the law school courtyard. And then the dean's welcome and plenary session, which you should not miss, will resume in this room at 5:45. So the reception, then come back for the plenary, for the dean's welcome and the plenary. And I also want to note there are so many other panels and workshops in this conference that many of the questions and comments that were raised specifically address. There's one on tenure and intersectionality. Right? So if you don't feel represented or your issue is not represented here, you will find it somewhere this weekend, and I invite you to partake of as much as possible. Thank you for being a great audience and asking great questions.